Hello, it's me again, and I bet you didn't see this one coming because I'm going to be talking about politics today, but a very niche type of politics. But before we talk about that, I changed my scenery a little bit, and I decided this is almost like a turn down service, but from me to you, I don't know. So I'm sitting on my bed. I've turned my bed down, so like I've reorganized my pillows for sleeping arrangements and pulled my covers forward, and I always have my books at the head of my bed. Is that how you say that? Right at the top of my bed. Probably why I have crazy dreams. I almost always remember at least some fragment of my dream, and they're usually quite crazy and quite chaotic. Crazy. I've always had that. I'm quite an erratic sleeper, but I love looking at my sleep score on my phone. I used to have an Aura ring like ages ago, like I'm talking 2021, like when the original Aura ring was out, and then I was like fine, and I was like, I actually wasn't looking at the metrics enough to be paying the subscription, and so then I stopped, and now everyone's getting like Aura ring, like I think they're on 4 now or something, and I'm like, but I just buying the Aura ring is expensive and then paying for the subscription, so I'm just using my watch at the moment. I need one thing really that gathers the metrics, right? I don't need everything, but I love looking at my sleep data. I'm not gonna look at it now because I'll fall into a loophole, a rabbit hole. But instead, I'm going to fall into a completely different rabbit hole, and that is the politics in the Empyrean series. So, I think that the reason that I enjoyed reading the Empyrean series by Rebecca Yaros, if you know what I'm talking about, Fourth Wing, Iron Flame, Onyx Storm, is because I liked the community of reading as they were being released and everybody else enjoying it a lot at the same time, because I think that I do prefer to read with a community because it entices me to read more. But anyway, I just thought, I know that the book kind of gets like, people are kind of either love it or hate it. Some people understand it, some people don't. It is romantasy. If I am remembering correctly, Rebecca Yaros hadn't really written anything romantasy prior to this, but she did write a lot of military romance, and her background is in terms of like her family is like a military family and that kind of thing. And so this was like her first segue into like a romantasy genre. And so you do see aspects of the military world or whatever in Fourth Wing, Iron Flame, and Onyx Storm. And so I was just thinking, I was like, in my head, like there's more to all of this than just, romantasy, dragons and morally grey and all of that. But it's also like a high stakes fantasy romance, and there's a lot of politics and like monarchy at one point. There's so many things to talk about, like isolationism, like using like weaponizing history, and then the morality of like having a war. And so I want to look at these like historical parallels and also like inferences that the reader can make based on what's being said, because I do think that a lot of times you kind of get lost in the story that you don't realize that there are some kind of like real world elements to these fantasy like fiction stories. And so we're going to see what the political subtext in Navarre is like. I need to talk slower because then I keep making all these mistakes and I'm positive that my lisp is going to come out. But anyway, so what is this? What are we going to call this? The wards of ignorance, an analysis of politics and power in the Empyrean? Maybe? Something like that. Anyway, so the reason I do have notes, so if you see me looking down, that's probably where I'm going to be looking, because otherwise I will go off on a tangent. But essentially, I think the original reason I was drawn to the series is because I didn't actually know it was a romantasy. I was told it was like an adult, newer version of like Harry Potter. They go to a school and they're learning how to fly dragons instead of like wizarding school. That's what I knew. I didn't really know anything else about it when I went into it. Obviously now having like read everything and like all the background and everything, I think the reason that the majority of people are drawn into the series is because of the dragons and the romance. And that really is the backbone of the world that Rebecca Yaros has created. But it is also a very recognisable political machine, because the Kingdom of Navarre is like not like your standard like fantasy monarchy. There's a lot of interesting military aspects. There's aspects of like surveillance and trades and like espionage and security, but like not in the way that we know it in our real world. And so what we realize is the greatest threat to the nation is actually not an outside enemy or an enemy that's outside its borders, but it's the lies that are being told within the population. And I thought that was so interesting because I think that kind of applies to like real world as well. A lot of times countries with like the traditional borders will always think that they have enemies or allies outside of their borders, but they don't always remember that they'll have enemies and allies within their borders, and it may be their own people who are turning against them or are becoming segregated or becoming weaponizing themselves or weaponizing communities or ideologies, you know, like extremists essentially. So without further ado, let's go. Let me get more comfortable. Sorry, I've just... Why is my nose so itchy? I think it's in my hair. Hold on. Do I need to pull my hair back? I look like an egg when I pull my hair back though. Now I've got a hair in my mouth. Great. Okay. So, the politics of the forever war and isolationism. Why can't I say that? Okay. So, the central conflict within the book is that there's been a 400-year war between Navarre and in Promille or whatever, and there's like, so that's basically the forever war. And then leadership in Navarre uses external threats, which is like the griffins and the flyers, to justify extreme domestic policies. So they have conscription into the riders quadrant, and then an authoritarian control and like a complete lockdown of borders. So just imagine if you're in your home country and you're told that when you reach a certain age you must be conscripted into the army, and that we will control everything you do, and if you want to leave the border you can't just do that off your own free will, you need permission. I fear in a lot of, it does exist by the way, but in a lot of places I feel like that wouldn't fly. And so if we're going to look at historical and modern parallels, so let's think about a war of like the rhetoric of war on terror. So if a modern government had used the threat of terrorism to justify increased surveillance or whatever, and like the use of military, that's exactly what Navarre is using by basically saying that there's evil Promille griffins, flyers, that kind of thing, to keep its citizens essentially afraid and obedient. And so that's very simple, is that like we're basically the only thing that's standing between you and death. You either do this or you die. But then we also have the ideology of Japanese Sakoku, I think you say it, which is essentially closed country, and Navarre's isolationism mirrors the policy that they used in the Edo period of Japan. So we're talking from 1633 through to 1853, so it was like a really long time, where borders were essentially sealed and they were preventing any foreign influence. And in Navarre, it isn't just about the culture, but it's about like holding on to resources and hoarding them. So, for example, the magical wards, and that means it doesn't matter about the rest of the world. The rest of the world could burn for all they care, and that's a very distinct critique of modern Western isolationism, where wealthy nations ignore global crisis, or crises if it's multiple. So like climate change, refugees, that kind of thing. As long as their own borders are secure. So we are seeing the things that they're talking about in this book, or inferring in this book, in real life, but we're just not clocking. And so what the reader maybe might infer if they have read into it, clearly in the way that I have, but had they looked past just the romance element and just the, like, they're in university essentially, just the like kind of young adult, it's not a young adult really, there's some spicy scenes in this book, but you know what I mean. Like if the readers look past that, they would potentially discover that this war is not being fought really to be won, but it's being fought to be maintained essentially, and a state of peace to its citizens is not really the answer, and it's rather that the war is protecting them and their resources and their borders. So as long as it's not directly affecting them, they don't really care. So we move on to weaponizing history, fake news, and what we're really talking about here in terms of the book is the scribes quadrant. And so perhaps quite an insidious arm in the series, but it's not just about the writers. I think that based on like the blurb, and if you're not reading into it, or you don't realize until much later on, that they very much from the start of the book make it appear like the riders quadrant, aka the military, are the, you know, the ones that are the ones that you need to watch out for, you know, the ones that are going to protect everyone, la la la. But I think what people actually should have read between the lines of is that it's actually the scribes who are essentially like the media, the historians, that kind of thing. And I think Violet Sorrengail, who is the protagonist in the book, realization that history is written by the victors is very important, and it's very literal, because that is true. If you think about it, I was thinking about this, obviously I was born and, you could probably tell from my accent, but I was born and raised in England, and so what we're taught in history at school is probably quite different from what people are taught in the US, what people are taught in Germany, what people are taught in Japan, what people are taught in China, because different parts of history are important to different sects of people, and different sects of people will have different answers to what happened in history. And essentially what we find out is that eventually, sorry if this is a spoiler to anyone, but essentially we find out that the scribes are the ones who write the history and can effectively redact the records or burn the books, rewrite the past, erase the past. They have erased the existence of the Venin, who is actually the true threat, and we're villainizing a rebellion who was really trying to help out. And so it is really just the way in which you frame the news. And I thought that was so refreshing to see that use of fake news, but in this sort of context, because what we see of fake news is, you know, AI content or deep fakes, or, you know, like rumors being spread around online that can't be refuted or can easily spiral. So if we talk about historical and modern parallels to what we've seen in the book, we're talking about the Orwellian revisionism. So sorry, I need to calm down. But anyway, if you've read George Orwell's 1984, there's a direct parallel to the Ministry of Truth in that. And then we also have, I mentioned banned books. That's a very normal thing. Like I always hear about it in the news, but there's always like politics about which books can be taught in schools, but also, you know, the idea that potentially at one point the church was banning books, that kind of thing. And then we're looking at colonialism, because the treatment of the marked ones, who are the children of the rebels in the books, mirrors that of the colonial powers that like treated indigenous or rebellious populations in the past, forcing them to either assimilate into society or be oppressed, and stripping them of their culture, essentially, which is like their relics, and forcing them to serve the state. And I just thought that that was quite an interesting way to put it in, because that is usually one of the byproducts that can happen based on political agendas and manifestos that people don't really see and or aren't really bothered about until it affects them. And you'll have seen it all through history, where people will go and colonize a specific area, and I can't remember the exact name for the I want to say theory, but it's not really a theory, but for the process. But it's essentially where people will go in, and rather than taking everybody out and essentially killing, like having ethnic cleansing, they choose to reorganize the leadership with their own people. And so eventually the culture or the ideologies of the people who are taking over will trickle down into that culture, and you're effectively changing it and making it and assimilating everybody to your ways and erasing their history, their culture. And that's happened so many times throughout history and continues to happen till this day. And that's very sad, because many times, things get lost to history. Imagine if there was traditions that you love and adore and they were lost to history because one group of people decided that they didn't like that. Really, really sad. Anyway, moving on. Monarchy versus the military industrial complex. So, in the book, to be honest, at first I didn't even notice in the series that there was really a monarchy. There was very vaguely mentioned, and I was like, oh, okay, whatever. And then later on I realised it's actually kind of important. But the relationship between King Tory and General Sorrengail represents the tension that we see often between like the crown, so that's like traditional ruling, and sword, or also so like the military or actual power, but also not just that. I would say almost what you might see between like a parliament and a monarchy as well, because there's always a little bit of tension there. But King Tory basically acts as a figurehead of the status quo, and so he represents a comfort in or the comfort of the lie, and he basically wears a crown, signs the papers, keeps civilians happy, with the illusion that there's a benevolent monarchy, whereas the military or General Sorrengail acts as the enforcer. And you will have seen this potentially in other books. I mean, this is quite a rogue place to mention it, but because of the word enforcer, I'll mention the Powerless series, because they specifically mention enforcer there. So it's people who basically are going to do the dirty work while the king sits comfortably. And so the dynamic that we see between King Tory and General Sorrengail, even though they don't have much like page-to-page airtime, if you'd like to call it that, is the military-industrial complex, where Navarre's entire economy, social structures and everything is essentially built around the war. They all know the war is happening. Every job that we ever hear about, or everyone, I mean, I know it's a book, doesn't talk about everything, but everything seems to centre around the war. They have the healers, they have like the normal, I can't remember what it's called, but essentially the foot soldiers, they have the riders quadrant with the dragons. It's all about the war. Their whole thing surrounds around the war. And it's normalized. Like the War College is the most prestigious institution, and like death is normalized for the sake of the state. Like patriotism, not patriarchy, patriotism. And the king basically allows the military to operate, and permits the cadets to like murder each other, and you know, it's all impunity. Because his power rests on their violence. And then we also have to remember, because I feel like it's hinted quite a few times, but it's not just the like human politics that are happening, it's the dragon politics as well. The Empyrean, which is essentially the collection of dragons are, also has a say on the power. So I think that that was interesting to say that they are their own entity. The Empyrean operates independently of human law, and it adds a layer of complexity, a layer of divine right politics, because humans think they're in charge. We think we're in charge. Interestingly, I watched the new Jurassic Park earlier on this year with Jonathan Bailey, and there was a scene where Jonathan Bailey talks about how like humans, like the world was here before humans existed, and it will probably be here long after we do, and that we will probably be our own demise. And I think that this kind of links to that, and that's crazy. But yeah, humans think they're in charge, but the nuclear weapons have their own agenda. So the dragons, humans think the dragons are their weapons, but really the dragons get to control everything. And so we also have a split within the Empyrean, which I feel like we haven't really dove into yet, because I think Rebecca Yaros, the author, is keeping it a little bit secretive. But we have those who hide the venom, because some of the venom have dragons, and those who want to fight them. And so it mirrors that of the human rebellion as well, which is really interesting. You wouldn't think that that would happen. So it suggests that in nature there's politics as well, and divide and isolationism. You know, like, because the dragons, I think we've heard a few times that all they want to do is protect the world at all costs, whereas there's some dragons who are on the path of we should intervene and save the world. So what can the reader infer from all of this? So if you manage to look behind all the romance and look at the political message of the series, you'll see that there's a giant big warning, like all these alarm bells ringing about institutional trust. Because one point that I think is being made is that the good guys are often just safe guys. Their protagonists will start off as enforcers of the state, but their journey ends up not being even about defeating the villain, but about unlearning a state of propaganda that they've been indoctrinated with. And then we also get the fact that neutrality is a form of complicity. Like they always say, if you're a bystander, you're also the problem. And so all the civilians of Navarre who are living comfortably, you know, behind their wards, while everyone in Promiol is being decimated by venin, represents the moral costs of privilege. And that the book is basically saying, is your safety worth someone else's genocide? So it's really quite deep if you really look into it. And then thirdly, that information is the true weapon. And I think a lot of people in the like modern day world or the present time have realized that anyway, because I do believe that, just as the book is pointing out, the most dangerous person is not a rider, or like not someone with physical power, or potentially even the biggest weapon. So in the book we're talking about Xaden, for example, but it's actually the person who knows the most truth or knows the most information and then decides how they're going to use it. And I guess in the books that's Violet or the scribes. So in conclusion, if we look at the world that Rebecca Yaros has built, I think the government that she's created, or the government structure that she's created, is quite interesting. It's very elite. It's, you know, you've got the dragons, you've got the military, and then you've got the fact that they're all hiding behind the war, essentially, and using it as a front. But they're feeding their youth to essentially a meat grinder to feed their lie further and further. And it serves as a modern critique of how nationalism can blind a population, and many of an atrocity can be committed in the name of, you know, protecting your country or war. And, you know, sometimes obviously, of course, if civilians don't know everything about a certain topic, they are not informed enough to, you know, refute it or whatever. And so we can say about the neutrality, but they may not know everything that goes on. And obviously, like I mentioned in the story originally, like people outside in Greater Premier, like the Griffins and the Flyers, are given a villainous portrayal, and so they think that they're the enemy, so they never really know. And I do think that, again, you see that in parallels in our real world. I won't name any specific ones, but many times if you're within a certain nation, you may be told that somebody or another nation is your direct enemy. And I guess the point is that actually really true, or is that just someone's agenda? Okay, that's it. Listen, I did a deep dive there, didn't I? I apologise if I kept looking down at my notes, but I didn't want to miss anything, and so that's why I was continuing to look. But until next time, I guess, and happy reading. Don't forget to look, especially if you have a favourite book, look behind the you know, the surface level reading, unless you like to surface level read, that's also okay. But I do think it's important. Listen, I love to tab now. Now, this is an interesting story. These I didn't tab for the reason that we're talking about today. I'm not even going to tell you about these because I fear that's for another day. But yeah, I hope everybody has a lovely time reading whatever it is that they're reading. See you next time.